They found the bones first. Not buried, not hidden, just scattered in a ring where the trees refused to grow, half sunk into black Ozark mud like the land itself was trying to spit them back out. Small bones, child bones. Gnawed clean in places, polished smooth in others, as if they had been handled again and again by living hands that knew them too well. The air in that hollow carried a smell that didn't belong to any season. Rot, smoke, and something older, something that had learned patience. The men who came upon the clearing later said the silence was wrong. No birds, no insects. Even the wind seemed to avoid the place. One of them swore he heard crying, thin and wet, coming from inside the earth itself. Another said it wasn't crying, it was singing. A sound passed down, voice to voice, blood to blood, until the words no longer meant anything at all. Long before anyone gave this place a name, before maps bothered to sketch the crooked spines of the Ozark Mountains, something had already decided to stay here, to close itself off, to fold inward, to survive by consuming its own reflection. The records would call it an isolated family, a curiosity, a tragic case. But those words come much later, when the damage is already done and the bones are already cold. At the beginning, there was only a hollow in the mountains, fog that never lifted, and a bloodline that learned to look inward when the world beyond the trees felt hostile and corrupt. If you're listening to this now, pause for a moment. Which city are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Because wherever you are, whatever light surrounds you, this story begins in a place where time learned to rot in place. The Ozarks have always been good at hiding things. Deep ravines cut like open wounds through limestone and oak. Springs that appear and vanish without warning. Trails that twist back on themselves, until you're certain you've been walking in circles. In the early 20th century, there were valleys no surveyor ever properly measured, pockets of land where families lived and died without leaving more than a smudge on a census page. Locals used to say there were hollows you didn't enter unless invited, places where dogs refused to follow, places where you could hear shouting at night but never see a fire. Some blamed moonshiners. Others whispered about old feuds that never ended, about families that stopped marrying outsiders because outsiders kept disappearing. Children were warned not to wander too far uphill, not because of bears or cliffs, but because people live up there who don't remember how to be people anymore. By the time anyone official took notice, the damage had layered itself over generations. Bloodlines bent inward. Names repeated until they lost meaning. Mothers who were also aunts. Fathers who were brothers. Children born carrying the quiet weight of every decision made before them. And somewhere in that hollow, a child was born who should not have been possible at all. The child came into the world without a doctor, without a record, without even a clear season attached to the memory of his birth. Later, when outsiders tried to reconstruct the moment, no one could agree whether it was late winter or early spring. The women only remembered the cold. The way the smoke from the cabin hearth pressed low against the rafters, and how the mother did not scream so much as whimper, like an animal too tired to protest what was happening to its body. He was small, too small. His skin carried a grayish cast, as though the blood beneath it hesitated to circulate. One eye opened wider than the other. His fingers curled inward, not fused, but reluctant to separate, as if they had never been properly instructed how to exist on their own. When he cried, it was thin and uneven, a sound that stopped and started again in the same breath. No one spoke of calling for help. Help came from the outside, and the outside was where things went wrong. The cabin, where he was born, sat at the lowest point of the hollow, close to a stream that ran cold even in summer. It had been added onto again and again over decades, rooms stitched together without plan, without symmetry. Walls leaned. Floorboards bowed. In some places, you could see the earth beneath the house breathing when people walked across it. The elders said the child was a sign, not of punishment, but of confirmation, proof that the blood still belonged to itself. He grew slowly, his body lagging behind his years. At 5, he moved like a much younger child, unsteady and prone to falling. At 7, his speech remained fractured, words clipped short or replaced by sounds only the family seemed to understand. But there was something else that unsettled even those who loved him. His eyes did not behave like a child's eyes. They lingered too long. They followed conversations he was not meant to comprehend. Sometimes he would repeat phrases he had no business hearing, whispered arguments between adults, old rules spoken only in council. He did not attend any school because there was no school to attend. His education came from watching, from listening, from absorbing a world that had been sealed off long before his birth. He learned which doors not to open, which names not to say aloud, which family lines were spoken with pride, and which were spoken only when necessary. Animals reacted to him strangely. Chickens scattered when he approached. Dogs refused to meet his gaze. Once, a goat was found dead near the stream, its neck twisted at an angle no fall could explain. The child stood nearby, silent, his hands stained dark, insisting he had only been trying to make it sleep. At night, he drew in the dirt with a stick, circles within circles, lines connecting names no one else remembered writing. When asked where he learned these shapes, he said he saw them when he closed his eyes. He said they were already inside him. And as the years passed, the hollow seemed to lean closer, as if listening to what the child was becoming. The mountains around the hollow were old in a way that resisted measurement. Limestone ridges folded and refolded, their surfaces scarred by centuries of water and neglect. Old maps from the county archives marked the area only as unproductive land, shaded lightly and left unnamed. A place bypassed by roads, avoided by rail, ignored by anyone with the means to leave. The families who settled there did so because nothing followed them in. By the time the child reached his 10th year, the outside world existed only as a rumor. Stories passed down like warnings rather than histories. Towns where people disappeared into buildings and never touched the earth. Churches where strangers asked questions that led to arrests, separations, and disease. The elders spoke of papers and signatures as if they were curses, symbols that could bind a person without chains. The child listened to all of it. He learned the genealogy before he learned his own age. Names recited in careful order, branching and folding back, a tree that did not grow outward but inward, roots tangling with roots beneath the soil. When he traced those lines in the dirt, the elders corrected him only when he made a mistake. They never asked why he needed to draw them at all. As he grew, the differences between him and the other children sharpened. His body remained fragile, but his presence carried weight. Younger cousins followed him without instruction. When disputes broke out, he stood too close, watching until voices dropped and arguments dissolved into uneasy silence. There were moments when adults caught themselves explaining things to him they would never have explained to a child. At night, screams began to echo through the hollow. Not every night, just often enough to become part of the rhythm of living there. The elders said it was foxes, or owls, or the wind moving through the ravines in the wrong way. But the screams came from inside the cabins, slipping through warped boards and unsealed doors, and they always stopped suddenly, as if cut off mid-breath. The child was never afraid of those sounds. He started keeping small objects beneath his sleeping pallet: teeth, bits of cloth, locks of hair tied with twine. When asked why, he said they were important, that they belonged together. Once, an older woman tried to take them away. She returned the next day with her hand bandaged and refused to speak of what had happened. Dead animals appeared more frequently after that. Raccoons arranged in careful rows, a deer gutted but not eaten, its organs placed in a shallow pit and covered with leaves. No one claimed responsibility. No one asked the child where he had been. By then, the family had begun to whisper about blood in a different way, not just as inheritance, but as instruction, as memory. They said some children carried more of it than others, that some were born closer to the beginning. The child heard this and smiled, a small, uneven smile that showed too many teeth. And somewhere beyond the hollow, beyond the fog and the unmarked trails, the world continued on, unaware that something inside the Ozarks was learning how to name itself. By the time the child reached his 12th year, the rituals no longer hid themselves. What had once been instinct and habit hardened into structure, repeated the same way each season, each turning of the year marked not by calendars, but by blood and ash. The elders said the mountains demanded remembrance. That forgetting was what had weakened the outside world. They gathered at night in the largest cabin, the one built first, its beams darkened by generations of smoke. The floor had been worn into shallow depressions, where feet always stood in the same places. Candles were scarce, so they used rendered fat in shallow dishes, flames trembling and low, barely pushing back the dark. The child sat among them, not at the edge where children belonged, but closer to the center. No one questioned this. His head tilted as the elders spoke in voices stripped of warmth, recounting births, pairings, deaths. When names were repeated too often, they paused, as if the words themselves might break. It was during one of these nights that the child spoke out of turn. He corrected an elder on a lineage detail, named a woman long dead, and placed her correctly in the bloodline, not where she had been claimed to belong, but where she actually did. The room went still. The man he corrected stared at him for a long moment, then nodded once. The mistake was not mentioned again. After that, the child was no longer simply allowed to attend. He was expected. Strange marks began appearing on the interior walls of the cabins. Scratched symbols, shallow but deliberate, often placed near sleeping areas. Some resembled distorted crosses. Others looked like branching veins or folded figures with too many limbs. When asked who made them, no one gave a clear answer. The elders said the marks had always been there. The younger ones insisted they were new. The screams at night changed. They no longer sounded panicked. They sounded controlled, rhythmic, as if part of a process being carried out carefully. Children learned not to ask who was screaming or why it was always someone different. The child began speaking of dreams. In them, he said, the family stretched back farther than anyone remembered. Not just to the first settlers, but deeper, into a time before names were fixed. He said the blood had been bent once, long ago, and that everything since was an attempt to keep it from breaking entirely. He was found one morning standing barefoot in the stream, water rushing around his legs, staring down at something held just beneath the surface. When pulled away, he resisted with surprising strength. In his hands was a bundle of wet cloth. Inside it, the remains of something small and unmistakably human. No one called it a crime. They buried the bundle at the edge of the clearing, where the trees refused to grow. The elders spoke quietly about necessity, about corrections, about keeping the family from thinning out into nothing. By then, the child was no longer referred to by his given name. He was called something older, a word that meant both keeper and wand, the one who remembered when others forgot, the one who carried the family's shape inside his own body. And as his voice deepened and his frame twisted under the weight of inherited damage, the hollow itself seemed to respond. Fog lingered longer. The stream ran darker after heavy rains. Trails shifted, confusing even those who had walked them all their lives. The truth of his birth waited just beyond the next telling. A truth folded so tightly into itself that no one inside the hollow could see where it began. The truth did not arrive all at once. It never does in places like that. It surfaced in fragments, in contradictions, in slips of language that could not be pulled back once spoken. The child himself uncovered it, before anyone chose to tell him. He always did. It began with his mother's fear. She watched him differently as he grew, her eyes lingering on his face with an expression that shifted between reverence and dread. When he spoke with the authority of an elder, she flinched. When he touched her hand, she pulled away too quickly. At night, she prayed in a low voice, not asking for forgiveness, but for silence. One winter evening, while the others slept, the child followed her into the storage room beneath the cabin. There, wrapped in oilcloth and hidden behind sacks of dried corn, lay the old papers. Not many, just enough. A baptism record never filed. A marriage vow written in an unsteady hand. A genealogy chart that had been altered. Names scratched out and rewritten until the page thinned and tore. The child studied it without expression. The lines did not branch the way he had been taught. They looped. They doubled back. His father's name appeared twice. Once as a husband, once as a brother. His mother's name appeared as both daughter and wife. The bloodline did not merely fold inward. It collapsed. When he asked her to explain, she did not lie. Lying had never worked on him. She told him that her first husband had been taken by sickness, that the elders had decided she could not bring in outside blood, that her own brother had been chosen to keep the line intact. She told him it was necessary, that it had always been done, that the family could not survive otherwise. He asked her how old she had been. She could not answer. The realization did not horrify him. It settled into place, aligning with everything he already knew. The deformities, the whispers, the rules written and rewritten to justify what should not have needed justification at all. He saw himself clearly then, not as a mistake, but as an outcome. When the elders learned that he knew, they did not punish him. They did not deny it. Instead, they confirmed it fully, reciting the unions aloud, generation by generation, as if confession itself might sanctify the act. Cousins bound to cousins, uncles to nieces, brothers to sisters. Blood preserving blood until nothing else remained. They told him this was why he mattered more than the others. He carried more of the family inside him than anyone else alive. More repetition, more memory, more damage. He was proof that the line had not yet broken, even as it decayed. After that night, the rituals sharpened. Pairings were discussed openly in his presence. Girls were watched for signs of readiness. Boys were evaluated not by age, but by blood proximity. The family tree was no longer something drawn in the dirt. It was enacted in flesh. The child began to speak of futures, of which unions would hold and which would fail, of which children would be weak and which would survive long enough to matter. His predictions were not always right, but they were right often enough that no one questioned his authority. Outside the hollow, the world still did not know. Inside it, the family crossed a line they could never uncross, convinced they were preserving something sacred, unaware they were feeding a wound that would soon demand more than they could give. The town learned in pieces, the way shame always travels. A smell first, smoke that didn't rise straight, animals refusing pasture near the old trailhead, then a fire, sudden and uncontrolled, licking up the side of the hollow one summer night when the air was too still for accidents. Someone had come too close. A hunter found the edge of the property by mistake, following a wounded buck into terrain he didn't recognize. He later said he heard chanting before he saw the cabins. Low voices layered, overlapping, speaking names instead of prayers. He turned back before anyone noticed him, but not before he saw a girl standing barefoot near the tree line, watching him with an expression that did not belong on a child's face. He told the preacher. The preacher told the sheriff. The sheriff waited, because no one wanted to be the one to go uphill and ask questions that might not come back with answers. But rumors do not stay contained, they ferment. By autumn, the stories had reached a breaking point. Incest spoken aloud, children married too young, bodies buried without markers. The town responded the way towns always have when confronted with something they cannot process. They made it a problem to be erased. A group of men went up the mountain one night, without warrants, without permission, without a plan. They carried torches, rifles, and the certainty that what they were about to do was necessary. The cabins were empty when they arrived. The family had retreated deeper into the woods, leaving behind only animals and objects that no one wanted to touch. The men burned everything. They torched the main cabin first, flames climbing the blackened beams, as if they had been waiting for years to do so. Smaller structures followed. Bedding, clothing, the walls marked with symbols were reduced to ash. Livestock was shot and left where it fell. Papers were thrown into the fire unread, curling and vanishing before any record could be salvaged. No one spoke while it happened. By morning, the hollow was nothing but smoke and ruins. The men returned to town and agreed never to speak of it again. The preacher offered a sermon about sin and forgetting. The sheriff filed no report. The land went quiet. But the family did not vanish. They scattered. Some were taken by the state in the months that followed. Others disappeared into nearby counties under borrowed names. A few were never accounted for at all. The child was among those never officially found. For years, people swore they saw him. Older now, crooked in body, but unmistakable in presence, watching from tree lines, standing too close to roads at dusk. Once, a farmer claimed he came upon a man digging at the edge of a field, his hands red, his face familiar in a way that made the farmer turn and run. The town pretended it had all been resolved. The burned hollow was reclaimed by brush and silence. But beneath that silence, something waited. Records destroyed do not undo blood. Fire does not cauterize lineage. Decades later, someone would come looking for answers. Not out of fear, but curiosity. But curiosity, in cases like this, has a way of reopening wounds that never healed. He came in the late 1980s, carrying a briefcase that smelled of old paper and disinfectant. Not a policeman, not a preacher. A genealogist by training, a collector of anomalies by inclination. His interest had been sparked by a gap, a stretch of census pages where a cluster of surnames simply vanished between decades, as if erased with intention rather than neglect. He followed that absence into the Ozarks, At the county courthouse, clerks told him the records had been lost in a fire. Which fire, no one could say. At the church, baptismal ledgers showed names crossed out, rewritten, then crossed out again. Birth dates repeated with impossible precision. Mothers listed without fathers. Fathers listed twice under different roles. The patterns were subtle unless you knew how to look for them. He did. In a box misfiled under land disputes, he found photographs taken in the early 1960s. Black and white, poorly framed, children standing too close together, faces nearly identical. Adults with the same asymmetries repeated again and again. One image stopped him cold. A boy standing apart from the others, his spine curved, his head tilted slightly, as if listening to something beyond the frame. The archivist said she didn't know who he was. No name was written on the back. The genealogist began visiting the older residents. He asked careful questions. He never used the words incest or inbreeding. He spoke, instead of isolation, of family histories, of forgotten settlements. Most doors closed quickly. A few stayed open just long enough for something to slip out. They told him about the fire, about the night the mountain burned, about children taken away and adults who never learned how to live anywhere else. One woman admitted, in a whisper, that she had helped deliver a baby up there once. She said the child's eyes were already wrong, already knowing. He was shown the edge of the hollow, now thick with undergrowth. The ground still refused certain plants. The soil tested strangely, rich and depleted at the same time, as if too much of the same thing had been returned to it again and again. In a shallow depression near the old stream, he found bones. Not enough to reconstruct a body, just fragments. Small, worn smooth by handling. When he brought them to a university lab, the results came back inconclusive in ways that disturbed him more than certainty would have. The DNA markers overlapped excessively. Too many repetitions, too few distinctions. As if several generations had been pressed into one narrow genetic corridor. He began assembling the family tree. It did not resemble a tree at all. It was a knot. Lines doubled back, intersected, merged. Mothers became sisters. Fathers became uncles. In one branch, a woman appeared to have given birth to her own half-siblings. In another, a child's genetic profile suggested fewer ancestors than should have been mathematically possible. At the center of the knot, again and again, the same unknown male appeared. No birth record, no death record, just presence. The genealogist labeled him simply Subject Zero, and as the research deepened, he began to suspect that Subject Zero had not disappeared when the hollow burned. He had adapted, carried the family inward, the way it had always been carried. The tapes were the last thing he expected to find. They came from a defunct psychiatric facility 2 counties over, closed in the mid-1970s and quietly emptied without ceremony. Most of the patient files had been destroyed under routine record purges, but a handful of intake interviews had been transferred to microfilm and mislabeled. One reel bore no names at all, only a date range and a handwritten note transferred from rural custody. Background unclear. The voice on the tape was damaged by age and static, but unmistakably male, slow, careful. The speaker answered questions that were no longer audible, responding with statements that sounded rehearsed, as though they had been repeated many times before. He spoke of family as a single body, of blood as instruction rather than substance, of correction as an act of care. When asked about his parents, he laughed softly and said the question assumed separation where none existed. At one point, the interviewer pressed him about children. There was a pause. Then the voice replied that children came when the line required reinforcement. That some were kept. Some were returned to the ground. All were necessary. The genealogist felt a cold recognition settle in his chest. The physical description in the intake summary matched the boy from the photographs. Spinal curvature, facial asymmetry, unusual ocular movement. Estimated age mid-20s, though developmental markers suggested older. No clear origin. No surname given. The file ended abruptly with a transfer stamp and no destination. In the margins, someone had written a single word unplaceable. When the genealogist tried to trace where the man had gone after that, the trail dissolved. No death certificate, no discharge papers, just absence again. But absence, he had learned, did not mean non-existence. He returned once more to the forest. At dusk, standing near the old hollow, he heard movement uphill. Slow steps, deliberate. He told himself it was an animal, that the stories had sharpened his imagination. But then he smelled smoke, not from a fire, but from something recently extinguished. From the tree line, a figure watched him. Older now, thicker through the chest, bent, but not weakened. The face was familiar from the photographs, from the medical descriptions, from the dreams the genealogist had begun to have since starting this work. The eyes caught the fading light and held it. Neither of them spoke. After a long moment, the figure turned and disappeared into the trees, moving with a confidence that suggested the land still recognized him. The genealogist never returned to the site. His notes were sealed at his own request and deposited with a university under restricted access. In his final entry, he wrote that some bloodlines do not end. They retreat. They compress. They learn how to survive exposure by becoming harder to see. The Ozarks, he concluded, had not been emptied. They had learned how to remember. What remained after the records were sealed was not resolution, but weight. The land was left to grow over itself, leaves settling into depressions where cabins once stood, roots threading through ash and bone. Hikers passed through without knowing why the air felt heavier there, why sound seemed to dull, why compasses sometimes wavered for no clear reason. The forest did what it always does. It concealed without erasing. The genealogist aged quickly after that. Colleagues noticed his reluctance to discuss rural isolation, his refusal to supervise students, working on consanguinity cases. When asked why, he said some lineages should not be straightened. That forcing clarity onto certain histories only teaches them how to hide better next time. Privately, he admitted something else. He believed the child had never been just one person. The family's mistake was thinking blood only traveled forward. They never considered that repetition could compress identity, that generation after generation of the same unions could produce someone who carried not just traits, but voices. Memory layered so densely it began to act with intention, not evil, not madness. Preservation, in that sense, the fires, the arrests, the institutions, even the sealed archives had failed. They treated the outcome as a problem instead of a process. They removed people, but not the idea that created them. Years later, a nurse in a rural clinic reported a patient with a familiar asymmetry, a man with no documents, no fixed address, who spoke in careful, antiquated phrases and asked unusual questions about family histories in the area. He never returned for follow-up. In another county, a social worker encountered a group of children living off the grid, related in ways their caretaker struggled to explain. By the time authorities arrived, the site was empty. None of these incidents were officially connected. They didn't need to be. The Ozarks have always understood something the rest of the world prefers to forget. That isolation does not just protect people from harm, it also protects harm from scrutiny. that when blood is treated as law, law eventually loses its meaning, and that some legacies do not announce themselves with violence, but with quiet continuity. The child from the hollow was never meant to survive in the open. He was meant to endure in fragments, in behaviors, in patterns that repeat, just subtly enough to pass as coincidence. If you were to discover that your mother was also your sister, that your father carried the same blood twice over, that your body was not an accident, but a design refined by generations of fear and belief, what would you do with that knowledge? Because somewhere in those mountains, under layers of soil and silence, the answer is still being practiced. What remained was not justice and not closure, but residue. The forest closed over the hollow the way skin closes over a wound that never truly healed. Leaves filled the depressions where cabins once leaned. Roots pushed through layers of ash and bone, drinking from what had been returned to the soil too many times. Hikers passed through years later and felt only a pressure they could not name, a heaviness in the chest, a sense that sound behaved differently there, as if the air itself remembered listening. The genealogist understood, long after he stopped writing, that the failure had never been logistical. It had been conceptual. Everyone involved had treated the family as an aberration, a deviation, something that could be burned, separated, institutionalized, and forgotten. But the family had never functioned like a single unit. It had functioned like a principle. Blood was not just inherited. It was instructed, repeated, reinforced until identity stopped belonging to individuals at all. Generation after generation pressed into the same narrow corridor until memory no longer required teaching. It emerged fully formed. That was why the child had known things no one told him. Why the rules felt older than the elders who enforced them. Why removal and fire had never been enough. In his final notes, sealed and unsigned, the genealogist wrote that extreme isolation does not merely preserve culture, it distills it, strips away contradiction, leaves only what is repeated most often. In the hollow, fear had been repeated. Control had been repeated. Blood had been repeated until it learned how to speak for itself. Years later, scattered reports surfaced and vanished again. A man in a rural clinic with no paperwork and a family resemblance no one could place. Children found living far from roads, related in ways that folded in on themselves when questioned. Sites abandoned just hours before authorities arrived. Fires still warm, the ground freshly disturbed. None of it was proven. None of it needed to be. The Ozarks have always been good at holding onto what the rest of the country tries to bury. Not because the mountains are cruel, but because they are patient. They do not judge what grows in their hollows. They simply allow it to continue. The family did not survive intact. It survived diffused, carried forward in fragments of behavior, belief, and blood that no longer needed a name. And if one day you were to discover that your family tree did not branch outward, but inward, that the people who raised you were bound to you in ways no record ever admitted, that your body carried instructions written long before you were born, what would you do with that knowledge? Because somewhere deep in the mountains, that question is still being answered.